Kazuo Ishiguro was born in 1954 in Nagasaki, a Japanese city shadowed by tragedy as one of the targets of the atom bomb attacks that ended World War II. He moved to England during childhood, but the Japanese past informed his early novels, A Pale View of Hills and An Artist of the Floating World. The World War II era in his adopted country was at the heart of the book that made his literary reputation, The Remains of the Day, which won the Booker Prize and became an Oscar-winning film. After a science fiction story set in an alternative English past, Never Let Me Go, Ishiguro's seventh novel, The Buried Giant, combines the history of ancient Britain with fairy tale and legendary elements as an old couple go in search of their son. In my experience of interviewing fiction writers, there are some who have the plots of the next 10 novels in a notebook, and there are others who come to a full stop at the end of each book and have no idea what they'll do next. Which are you closer to?
I usually have about 5 novels, possible novels at any one point. So I'm probably closest to that. You know, I never come to a full stop, but I'm always fairly desperate when I finish a book. I think I'll never write another one again. None of these ideas will come right. When I say I've got ideas, it's not because I've got tons of ideas. Often I've got abandoned projects from the past. They're not quite abandoned. I always know that they're going to be returned to. And a lot of my books are like that, including the one that's I've just finished. It's a book that I put to one side at one point.
The Buried Giant, we'll talk about that. There's been a book of short fiction in between, but there has been 10 years between your 6th novel, Never Let Me Go, and this, your 7th. Your longest gap between novels, is that significant?
I'll tell you the real, one key reason why it's been 10 years since novels. I was getting on quite nicely with this Buried Giant, I thought I was. And when I'd written about 40 or 50 pages, which means I've done a lot of the background work, the research. I've decided on many things by the time I've actually got any words. I showed it to my wife, Lorna. I don't usually do this, but sometimes I do around that stage. I don't usually show my work to anybody else. I showed it to my wife, and she said, "This just will not do." She said, I don't mean there are a few things you're going to have to change, a few scenes that don't quite come. This will not do. You would have, if you want to, there's some interesting ideas here, but you would have to start from scratch.
Wow. Are you still married?
Yeah. No, I get a lot of this kind of thing. So this was a bit dismaying, but she's been my first reader from the time I first started to write. This is the point. She knew me when I wasn't a writer and kind of went, you think you can write. So I kind of understand the kind of things we tend to agree on, kind of things we don't agree on. She's a tough but very good first reader for me, and she always has been. So I had to reluctantly kind of take this on board. I just didn't have the energy to just start from scratch immediately. And so I put it to one side. This was 2 years after the publication of my last novel, Never Let Me Go. And I sat down and wrote the short story cycle. And then I came back to it.
Returning to the genesis of The Buried Giant, there was a newspaper report, and those are, of course, not always reliable, that claimed that you were writing a vampire novel, but were put off by the success of the Twilight and True Blood franchises. Is that true?
I was writing a vampire novel at one point. And there's a vampire movie I was working on about 10 years ago. I thought would be a, but it wasn't like a teen vampire movie. It was, I might return to it. It's kind of very elegiac, kind of, about the fading of the kind of the vampire classes, in Europe, the old vampire families in Europe, kind of.
So sort of Chekhovian vampire story.
I guess so. Yes. When are we going to Moscow to have a little bit to replenish our supplies? Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. I thought it was a good environment for talking about some things about Europe and about the change of generations, and also about parents who wish the best for their children and who say, I hope my offspring don't make the mistakes or don't bear the negative traits that I have. You want them to not be a vampire, perhaps, and you hope that, oh, this one isn't going to be a vampire.
Wow, I want to read this. So when you have, when you say, as you have 5 or so ideas knocking around between books, what is it that decides that the 7 novels we have, why are those the ones that, like the sperm reaching the egg or whatever, why are those the ones that have that you decided to write?
The stories that appeal to me when they occur to me, or if I hear of some situation like that in the news or something, they do tend to have certain characteristics. But I kind of know the terrain that is mine. And I suppose anyone who's read more than 2 or 3 of my books will be easily able to spot what tend to be the thematic and emotional things that I always return to. So I can kind of recognize a premise or a story as something that's likely to serve me. And so then I'll start to kind of think about that. But often I can't take it to the next stage. I can't really, that last piece of the jigsaw doesn't come along. So with that book, Never Let Me Go, I had 3 goes at writing that book, twice in the 1990s and then just more or less, at the turn of the century. And there's often one element to the story or the premise that isn't there. In the case of Never Let Me Go, it's only the 3rd time round I thought of this kind of sci-fi-ish kind of conceit that the book should be about young people who are actually clones who are being harvested for organ donation.
I'm not trying to boast, but I feel a great sense of pride in what we do. Carers and donors have achieved so much. That said, we aren't machines. In the end, it wears you down. I suppose that's why I now spend most of my time not looking forwards, but looking back to the cottages and Hailsham and what happened to us there.
So in the earlier versions, there were young people who were in some kind of confinement.
There were young people whose lives were artificially shortened.
Right.
But I couldn't get that quite right.
And you didn't know why at that point?
I knew why they had to be like that because I was writing a book about the human lifespan. How we face, something that we all know that we have a limited lifespan, and towards the end, even if we're lucky, we're going to kind of lose bits of ourselves, and we'll go. And so the story was about how people, when they know their time is limited, to what extent do they reach out for each other? What becomes the important things between people? Memories, friendship, love. That's what the story had to be about. And I had this idea that if I create young people who are like old people by some sort of device, then we'll suddenly get a new perspective on something we're overly familiar with, which is the human lifespan, and the fact that we go from young to middle-aged to old, and then we get ill. I thought this will be a startling way of looking at how the stages of life if it all happens within in the life of a 30-year-old. But I couldn't for a long time find a way of doing it. I had funny versions where they came across nuclear materials and things like this, and other little ideas. It would never come off. So that tends to be what happens with me. That there's something missing in the execution of a theme or the mounting or orchestrating of a story. And so I can't get it right. And then something occurs to me, and then I think, whoa, yeah, we can go. Now we can go.
I've been keeping tabs on you over the years. And Tommy, too.
What do you hear about Tommy?
That he's done his 2nd donation, too, and apparently he's doing very well on it. Apparently he's in better shape than some after their 1st donation.
Good old Tommy. I'm not surprised.
He's surprised at me. I expect I look a bit broken, Kath. It's okay. think I'd want to survive my third donation anyway.
You talk about the things that, across people who've read all your books, that recur. One of them, the Buried Giant, it takes place in a version of ancient Britain, but with some fairy tale elements. But even Never Let Me Go, we mentioned, which is a science fiction novel, but it takes place, in effect, in an alternative past. Not one of your 7 novels takes place in a recognisable documentary present, as you will be well aware. Was it a conscious or unconscious decision to write about the past always?
It's always a conscious decision. You know, there's always a reason for setting a particular book in a particular setting. And for instance, The Remains of the Day, I remember I said to myself, I'm going to write a book that is not set in Japan, because up to that point, my career had entirely been in kind of Japanese set fiction. And at that point, you know, Britain was a very different kind of place. And I was very much seen as a kind of Japanese writer who happened to be a bit like a foreign correspondent in Britain. Around the time I was writing my 3rd novel, I thought, yeah, I'm going to resist this role. You know, I do not want to spend the rest of my writing life labelled as the person who's going to explain Japan or Japanese people to the West. So that was a conscious decision. You know, this one's going to be set in England, you know, and it's going to be set in a kind of like a ultra English England, you know, to some extent constructed out of mythical England, you know, English heritage England. You know. So you could almost say I have been forced to retreat into a non-realist setting with my books, because probably ever since a book I published in 1995 called The Unconsoled, which you probably remember, you know, which is set in a kind of a very dreamy, kind of strange alternative reality. Ever since then, I think I've almost reluctantly have had to move away from what you might call a social realist kind of setting. And this is because I think I always want my stories to have a metaphorical dimension to them. I want readers to think this isn't literally about England in the 1930s, or you know, or wherever the place happens to be. You know, I want them to try and apply this story to today or to other points in history. I want people to think this is not exactly an allegory, but more metaphor.
Although Buried Giant is a sort of fable, isn't it? I mean, it has that.
Well, I think I've always been moving towards fable for this reason. You know, I'm not a kind of journalistic kind of novelist. I don't want to write a novel to explain to people what's going on in Beirut now, or you know, what's going on in the recession in America now. But I think from the off, I'm wanting to usually create worlds that are quite metaphorical. And one of the ways of doing this, I think, to try and discourage a literal interpretation, is to kind of signpost that my world is a bit wonky, it's a bit strange, you know. And the other way to kind of retreat into a more metaphorical setting, I suppose, was to choose a setting rather like the one I've chosen for Buried Giant. You know, it's a semi-mythical England of the very, very distant past. And I think I did that because I had spent some years kind of looking at many contemporary situations, the breakup of Yugoslavia, France after the Second World War, you know, Japan after the Second World War. I was looking at situations where societies had to ask themselves, how accurately do we want to remember our past as a society, as a nation? Are there times when it's better just to forget? Otherwise, we're going to descend into civil war. We're going to descend into violence. You know, we'll never end the cycles of hatred and bitterness between the different groups within our community. And so, for instance, I can well understand the kind of the General de Gaulle position after the Second World War, to say, you know, let's all pretend in France that we're all brave resistance fighters. Let's forget the fact that in every small village somebody betrayed somebody. You know, we sent our own Jews to the gas chambers with very little help from the Germans. You know, we got on with collaboration, quite enthusiastic. Let's forget that. Let's pretend we're all resistance fighters. And I can understand that, you know. But
and I know it's a stereotype, but I mean, in Japan there was a great forgetting, wasn't there?
yes, there's a massive forgetting, and it continues. I mean, every day, today, even now, there's controversy about Japanese textbooks. The relationship with China and Southeast Asia in general remains, I think, unresolved for Japan, precisely because Japan will not look properly at her role during the Second World War. But once again, there were very good reasons for forcibly forgetting, you know, and to some extent, the West, if you like, the conquerors encouraged this. I mean, the priority after the Second World War was that Japan was built as rapidly as possible into a capitalist superpower. Yeah. And then you can say, you know, it was successful. You know, Japan became a very stable, you know, liberal democracy as a result. This question of when is it better to forget, when is it better to go back over things, there are always huge areas of a nation or community's collective memory that tends to be buried, perhaps for good reason, but there's always this question, should we have buried it? To some extent, justice demands that some things get unearthed. And then there's the usual kind of therapy argument. Then if you bury things, they'll come back to get you in some other way, and you will always be dysfunctional.
The buried giant, indeed.
The buried giant, yeah, that's what the buried giant is about. And so I've always been interested in how individuals struggled with uncomfortable memories about their past. But I've always wanted to also write about how societies struggled with, you know, remembering and forgetting. But you know, as I said, you know, I could never quite get the last piece of the jigsaw. I kept trying to, for about 15 years, I kept coming up with different ideas for how to do, you know, the struggle to remember, the struggle to hide from the past, the struggle to look squarely at the past, at the societal level. I could never quite get a right kind of story to do this. With The Buried Giant, I was interested in contrasting the issues about remembering and forgetting for a marriage, because I think the same kind of things I've been saying about society applies to marriage. You know, the same questions apply. You know, most marriages have areas that are uncomfortable in the past. You know, do you keep dwelling on them, or is it better to forget and move on? And does love suffer when you bury things and move on, or is that the only way love can survive sometimes?
When I was outside just now, doing my best to remember all I could in the stillness, many things came back to me. But I can't remember our son, neither his face nor his voice, though sometimes I think I can see him when he was a small boy, and I'm leading him by the hand beside the riverbank, or when he was weeping one time and I was reaching out to comfort him. But what he looks like today, where he's living, if he has a son of his own, I don't remember at all. I was hoping you'd remember more, Princess.
This is a kind of a story about a marriage with large areas forgotten, and it's about a society that has come through, in a not so distant past, a period of kind of civil war, and something has happened to impose the current peace. But in order to maintain the peace, people have to have bad memories. You know. But if I'd set this book in you know, Bosnia in the 90s, or in Rwanda, you know, in the years after the massacre, people would think it was actually about the disintegration of Yugoslavia, or you know, the Rwanda massacre. You know, I kind of didn't want to write a book that was journalistic in that sense about a specific historical period. I wanted something more universal. So, hence the retreat into kind of what you might call fantasy, into myth.
I understand that you want to write universal fables and stories that are not specific, but in every single case, it's like the last lines of The Great Gatsby, you're ceaselessly born back into the past. Even in a science fiction novel, such as Never Let Me Go, you go back into the past. The vast majority of your fiction is set in a past, isn't it?
I suppose so. I mean, you know, Never Let Me Go, I suppose, you know, takes place in what was then the present day, you know, when I was writing it, with the characters looking back to their youth, so that it would kind of go back to the 1970s. You know, but I suppose I made a decision not to set it in a future world. You know, but that was for kind of genre reasons, really. I didn't want it to be seen as like a prophecy. But the past is kind of very important to me because my subject matter often has to do with human beings gaining perspective over a period of time on their lives. You know, the passage of time, what it does to people.
But that's what I'm getting at, is that you're an unusual kind of historical novelist, I think, that something like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall is a historical novel. It's a novel about history. Your novels, you play with history. They're about the effects of history. But in that sense, you're a novelist about history, I think. I mean, that, as you say, that's your subject.
Yeah, that's probably putting it very well. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm interested in what history does to people, or you know, how history shapes the way we see our world. I'm interested in the question, what is history? I'm interested in the question, you know, how do people sometimes deploy historical memory for political ends? Why are some memories from the past unearthed conveniently when there is a particular kind of agenda for what should happen next year? You know, the battle over history, which is basically a kind of memory, you know, is the battle about the present and the future, as we see all the time. You know. And so that's what fascinates me. You know, a couple, when they look at their photo albums together, you know, do they remember the same things? You know, do they recall the same things about when they first met or when they were young? Can love actually survive if you don't have shared memories? I mean, I think all of these things are very, very important.
We talk about recurring things across the 7 novels. Two of the key words in your fiction are probably I and you. All 7 novels have a first-person narrator of some kind, although that person might be a man, a woman, a clone, or more than one I, as I say. Often, as is the case again in The Buried Giant, an I will address the reader very directly as you. That does look like a policy decision by now.
Yeah, I've always rather liked it when I'm reading a book and the narrator says you to me. You know, I think, oh, you notice I'm holding this book. You know that I'm reading this book. But of course, after a while, you realise that the you might not actually be. You know, I mean, it's some other you know, and you kind of feel like you're eavesdropping on a conversation between the narrator and somebody else, you know, and that was the effect I've usually gone for. It was a deliberate kind of literary kind of device in many cases, because I was trying to create the sense that the narrator has a very limited perspective. You know, Stevens the butler in Remains of the Day, he's addressing another servant or another butler. He can't really imagine a world beyond his very confined world of service. And so the you that keeps coming up in The Remains of the Day is another servant. You know, he says, I don't know what happens in your household. And Cathy, the narrator of Never Let Me Go, assumes that the you who is reading is somebody rather like her as well. You know, someone who does what she does and is another clone. I find this a very simple and economical device for creating the sense of the claustrophobic, narrow perspective of a particular character or narrator, that they can't even imagine a reader being outside of this little confined world.
Thinking back now, I can see we were just at that age when we knew a few things about ourselves, about who we were, how we were different from our guardians, from the people outside, but hadn't yet understood what any of it meant. I'm sure somewhere in your childhood, you too had an experience like ours that day. Similar, if not in the actual details, then inside, in the feelings. Because it doesn't really matter how well your guardians try to prepare you. All the talks, videos, discussions, warnings, None of that can really bring it home. Not when you're 8 years old and you're all together in a place like Hailsham. When you've got guardians like the ones we had. When the gardeners and the delivery men joke and laugh with you and call you sweetheart.
I'm quite careful about choosing narrators. I kind of audition characters to be narrators. I do give it a little go with usually one of two or three characters. What would happen if this person narrated? What would happen if this person narrated this particular story?
And you talk about auditioning, and it is a kind of acting, but it's a sort of voice that, if in first-person narration, the voice is very important. Do you vocalize them or act them out?
I don't literally go about the house in role, but in some kind of way, I feel I should be able to. I don't think line by line when I'm actually writing with a first-person narrator. I have to get it to the point where I can, if I wanted to, I could go downstairs and have a conversation with my wife, over lunch, in the voice of, Kathy, the clone, or Stevens, the butler, or whatever. It's kind of like method acting in that sense. And the trouble with that is, so it makes the kind of writing itself much easier. You're not worrying, this bit. You're just going to the role. It can take a while to come out of it, though. And sometimes people have said it took me a while to come out of the butler voice, that it inflected at least, two of my novels afterwards. And it was some sort of thing I hadn't shaken off. And there's some validity in that.
Well, maybe you said in an amazingly candid moment when we did an interview about 10 years ago that you thought you'd written the same book 5 times in some sense.
I think I've written the same book about 3 times. And then after that, they incrementally change. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you say it's very candid. I don't feel it's that candid. I think
there are many writers that would say that.
Well, I've always thought, perhaps I'm very naive here, but I've always thought that is the proper thing for a serious writer. That you shouldn't be too promiscuous about subject matter. You can be as promiscuous as you like about setting, even genre, but about the things that you really write about, the important things that you write about. Once you become a kind of a mature writer, I kind of feel that actually almost by definition means that you have certain themes and subject matter and emotions that you want to explore. I actually admire writers who seem to write the same thing over and over again. You don't literally want it to be the same thing. You want it to have moved on. Mm. But I want it to be a refinement or another take on the same kinds of questions. I'd like to think that I move on. I think the most blatant example of a remake, in my case, is between my second and third novels. An Artist of the Floating World, Remains of the Day. If you remove the settings, one is kind of Japan, or one is England, but you remove those. The stories are very similar. They're about aging people who invested their best years in values that they come to see are flawed. Not only have they wasted their talents, they've actually contributed to something bad, fascism usually, because they lived through the period of fascism and Nazism. And how do they come to terms with that in the new world, in the new post-World War II world? Basically, it's the same story. But I think, The Remains of the Day has an extra dimension, because I think at the end of the second novel, I thought this is all about the theme of the wasted life, but confined really to the area of careers. It's about vocation and careers. There's very little in it about your personal life, and if you're talking about wasting lives, you can't just talk about it in terms of your career. Your life doesn't stand or fall just in terms of your career. For most people, career is a relatively minor thing. It's their family, it's the being loved by somebody. It's all these things that really make a life. Was it worthwhile or was it not? So I thought, well, let's do this again, and this time we'll have both things. Let's have a guy who wastes his life both vocationally and emotionally. And so, you know, you kind of, it's a remake, but it's you know, it's a refinement. You move on.
Mr. Stevens.
Yes?
I have something to tell you. My friend, the man I'm going to meet tonight, you know him, Mr. Ben.
Oh, yes, Mr. Ben, of course, yes.
He has asked me to marry him. I am thinking about it.
I see.
He's moving back to the West Country next month.
Hmm.
I'm still thinking about it. I thought you should be informed of the situation.
The other thing about using narrators is that no matter how sophisticated we claim to be as readers, we have a natural instinct to believe an narrator. And you, particularly in those two books, Artists of the Floating World and Remains of the Day, you play with that because they may be lying to themselves, they may be lying to us, they often are, and yet we somehow want to believe the person, at least at the beginning.
If I started to interrogate you instead now, and I, you know,
it's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. But if I, you know, if I started to ask you all kinds of things about your past and your career and whatever, I'll be foolish to think that, you know, I can take everything at face value.
Because everyone is an unreliable narrator of their own life. I mean, that's just, yeah.
And they're unreliable to themselves, let alone when they're presenting themselves publicly on, you know, on Facebook or whatever. They are unreliable because that's natural, that's human nature. And that's what, to some extent, that's what makes people interesting. You know, the way in which they lie to themselves. You know, what are the things they wish to embellish? What are the things they wish to downplay? You know, these are the things that give you a clue as to who these people actually are, what the emotional life of people really is. You know, I think we are all unreliable in a very normal way that we all instinctively recognise if we're listening to you know, our friends in a pub, or, you know, if you're just listening to a stranger spilling out, you know, on the bus to us about their lives or whatever. I mean, we don't take them at face value. We interpret what they're saying. You know. And that's what I ask my readers to do with my narrators.
It is sometimes said that butlers only truly exist in England. Other countries, whatever title is actually used, have only manservants. I tend to believe this is true. Continentals are unable to be butlers because they are, as a breed, incapable of the emotional restraint which only the English race is capable of. Continentals, and by and large the Celts, as you will no doubt agree, are as a rule unable to control themselves in moments of strong emotion, and are thus unable to maintain a professional demeanour, other than in the least challenging of situations.
Ever since your first book came out, that line in the biographical note, born in Nagasaki, it's always jumped out at people, understandably. When growing up there, at what stage did you understand the astonishing historical weight of that place name?
I think I remember quite clearly, although this might be one of my little false memories. I was about 7 years old, and I was in primary school in England, 2 years after I had left Nagasaki. And I was looking in a school encyclopedia, and I came across Nagasaki as an entry, and there was a mushroom cloud next to it, you know, a picture of a mushroom cloud next to it. And I read the entry, and it occurred to me with almost like a strange sense of pride that the town I had come from was one of only 2 places in whole of world history that had ever been struck by an atomic weapon. And it wasn't really until this particular moment when I opened this encyclopedia in a very different country, and I realized that that's what Nagasaki stood for many people. It was a place where the atomic bomb fell. Because for me, that's not what Nagasaki was. Nagasaki was a place where I grew up. You know, it's my kindergarten, my grandparents.
Across the harbour, on the opposite bank, rose a series of hills that led into Nagasaki. The land at the foot of the hills was busy with houses and buildings. Far over to our right, the harbour opened out onto the sea. We sat there for a while, recovering our breath and enjoying the breeze. Then I said, "You wouldn't think anything had ever happened here, would you? Everything looked so full of life, but all that area down there," I waved my hand at the view below us, "all that area was so badly hit when the bomb fell. But look at it now."
And in terms of language, did you speak Japanese until you came to?
Yes, I continued to speak Japanese in the home.
At home?
Yeah.
And then English at school?
Yeah.
Right.
I still speak to my mother in Japanese. If I pick up the phone now and speak to her, I go into Japanese. Very bad Japanese. It's like a child's Japanese with a few kind of supplementary words, you know. Yeah, so for this reason, my command of English doesn't have a very firm foundation. Because I didn't have English-speaking parents as such. My English is picked up, wherever I went. And also, I used to watch American cowboy programs when I was 5, 6, 7. Things like Wagon Train and Cheyenne, and things like this. And so I had no English lessons at all, so I was just picking it up in a magpie fashion. And for a while, I spoke a strange mixture of kind of Texas, from cowboy land. Yeah, I would say things like "howdy" and things like this to people. It was rather odd, and then I started to read Sherlock Holmes novels, and that confused me even more because I started speaking this kind of Victorian, early Edwardian kind of English too. So I've never had a kind of firm kind of bedrock of kind of English vernacular, English style, on which I was raised, that most English people would have. So the English language is slightly malleable for me.
Which is very interesting because, as many critics have pointed out and readers have noticed, the English of your narrators is most often formal, almost Edwardian in many cases. Very, very little slang, very few metaphors. You write English very formally, or your narrators speak very formally.
Some of that is down to my natural carefulness about written English, because I don't have perhaps the same foundation. But I think a lot of it is just historical in my case. When I first started to write fiction, I was actually using Japanese narrators. So I had to mimic somebody who was writing in a second language. And so I couldn't use English slang. It's not just so much formality. I had to create a language that somehow hinted at Japanese syntax, Japanese rhythms. I didn't want it to sound Greek either. It had to sound vaguely Japanese.
And then Stevens is not going to say howdy to people either. I mean, he would have very formal English for professional reasons, wouldn't he?
Yes, and he'll be, I suppose, an uneducated person who, because of his position, is obliged to speak in a kind of a pseudo-posh way. So, that's the language that he would speak in. That kind of language, suited my purposes beautifully because I am talking about people who are very consciously presenting themselves. As we said before, they're trying to hide from certain memories and explore certain other. It's very much a conscious presentation of who am I, what kind of person am I.
And even in your career as an author, there was a certain amount of cultural stereotyping in Britain. One critic suggested you should commit ritual suicide after one of your books. Does that sort of stuff, does that amuse or irritate you, that kind of thing?
It's mainly just amusing, but cumulatively, it does become a little irritating if it seems to be distorting the way people read my books. And when you just read your reviews one after the other, and it goes from carp fish kind of in Japanese ponds to karate experts to whatever, samurai, glittering swords, and you look at the Times and it's one thing, and Telegraph and everything. It does start to get a bit wearying.
There's also something slightly more insidious, which was the your prose would be described as reserved and inscrutable and all that kind of stuff, which is one of the ultimate Western stereotypes, isn't it?
Yes, but I don't know, maybe this is a case where stereotype is born out. But I mean, this calm, unemotional, perhaps even repressed, deliberately, emotionally repressed style. I'm often praised for that. People sometimes suggest this is something I have very skillfully invented. But I tell you what happened with that. I mean, when I was writing my first novel and my second novel, I was just trying to write in the best way I possibly could. I wasn't actually thinking consciously about a style. And as we discussed before, I had a certain natural carefulness anyway about writing. And it's only when the reviews started to come out that people repeatedly said, oh, he has this kind of wonderfully kind of a calm style. Even when talking about quite florid emotions, the surface of the writing is so still, like a Japanese pond with kind of a carp beneath the surface, but the surface is so still, and it's very zen. And actually, it's a case where the reviews or the reaction had an impact on me. I actually thought, oh, that's interesting, because that's just the way my voice came out naturally on paper. But there does seem to be a consensus about its emotional values. People seem to have mistaken it for a style when I'm just trying to do my best to write decent English. So I kind of incorporated this into my kind of PR. I kind of said, yes, it's quite difficult to do that. It's a very measured kind of technique of mine. And by the time I got to The Remains of the Day, I think I'd become so self-conscious, perhaps, about the fact that my natural writing voice tended to come out this way anyway, that I actually thought I would apply it to a very emotionally suppressed man. That was a time when I actually decided to exploit it and actually consciously use something that perhaps was a natural attribute of my voice. I'm told singers do this sometimes. I mean, obviously because one's larynx is the way it is. We all sing in a particular way without being conscious of it.
And you say you hadn't thought about style, but you were part of the University of East Anglia creative writing course. The late Professor Sir Malcolm Bradbury, he at that course famously also produced Ian McEwan. Because he had quite a light touch, I think, didn't he, as a tutor, Malcolm Bradbury?
Yes, I had two tutors, Malcolm Bradbury and Angela Carter. That's not a bad pair, actually. Malcolm was the person who had set up the course. And it might be hard for young people today, particularly aspiring writers, to believe this, but back in those days, nobody wanted to do a creative writing course. I mean, it was a joke. It was the only creative writing MA in the country, I believe. Most people at the University of East Anglia thought it was either a disgrace or, at best, it's rather an indulgent, thing. But Malcolm Bradbury was such a distinguished academic that he had to be allowed his little pet thing. He basically wanted to give people the chance for 1 year, literally 12 months, they could take themselves seriously as writers. They wouldn't have to worry that they should be getting on with a day job or anything else. The idea was to psychologically give people both the permission and the challenge of being writers, full-time writers for a year, to see what happened to them. He was very much in favor of just throwing people onto themselves or throwing them at that blank page. And he told me years later, after I did it, that, a lot of people had a traumatic time because they discovered that they weren't writers. They had nurtured this idea that that when the conditions were right, they would be able to become writers. But they were too busy, nobody gave them the chance. And it was very important for them to believe that there was this part of them that was waiting to spring out. And it was a very painful discovery to spend 12 months in the Norfolk countryside with nothing else to do but produce fiction, and nothing is appearing. And Malcolm said, that often happened, and it was painful to watch. But in a way, he thought that was quite as important as the experience of discovering that you were a writer.
But you discovered that you were a writer.
I discovered that I was a writer. Yeah, I kind of knew I was something because I was a songwriter before then.
You'd had a gap year between school and your first degree at University of Kent. You were going to be a pop star, were you?
Not a pop star, no. I was going to be a very serious kind of a singer-songwriter. I was hesitating to say I was going to be somebody like Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen, but those were the great heroes of the singer-songwriting tradition of that time. I say I hesitate to say that because I and my friends who were also trying to do the same thing at that time were very conscious that these were American artists, North American artists, and that we shouldn't sing our songs in American vernacular, and the music shouldn't be American either. We had to reflect the English landscape. It was going to be the A40, not Highway 61. Towards the end of my songwriting career, I started to get the hang of it, and it was a very natural transition for me to go from those songs to my first short stories, and then to my first novel. And I feel I learned an enormous amount about writing fiction from writing songs in those days. And I think I went through a lot of the stages that many novelists go through early in their careers as a songwriter. I think my first novel was effectively written in song. So I'd written my
A Pale View of
adolescent...
Howells?
No. I mean
no,
my...
right.
The classic first novel.
Okay, yeah.
The adolescent angst novel. And also the kind of the purple prose Joycean phase. I went through all of those in my songwriting.
Were they first-person songs?
Yes. No, I think that's a very interesting thing you say there. I think you asked me earlier about my fidelity to the first-person narrative. I think that's still a hangover from my songwriting. I still think of my novels at some level to be some sort of like a song. There's a singer singing in the first person, creating a world. It's a continuation of that. As I say, my last songs and my first short stories, I think, have many, many things in common. And a lot of the things that people would identify as my style, the things that have remained the same throughout my career, the calm surface, the meaning being slightly oblique between the lines. I mean, these are things that are very natural if you're writing a song. And I think the first-person style is very much something to do with being a singer-songwriter.
We've spoken about Remains of the Day in various ways and winning the Booker Prize. In terms of expanding, I mean, that was the great career expanding moment, wasn't it? Because there were two bursts. There was winning the Booker Prize for Remains of the Day, and then the movie, which is a huge thing, huge Oscar nomination. You hadn't written the screenplay for it, but it was your story. I mean, that was a career-changing experience, that book.
Yes, definitely. But actually, on a day-by-day basis, it was the previous novel, the second novel, Artist of the Floating World, that was shortlisted for the Booker, and it won what was then called the Whitbread Book of the Year. It's now called the Costa Book of the Year. That was the moment for me when I went from being somebody who knocking on doors and being ignored to somebody who had to get used to turning people down. Most of the things about the Remains of the Day success, I would say, have been positive. It enabled me to think much more freely about what to do next. It took away the pressure of having to do things like win Booker Prizes and things like this. That can become very restricting as well. You become reluctant to take risks. And I think it's very important that you should feel sometimes that you can go onto territory that's not so familiar, and it might fail, but you've got to do that in order to keep moving on. And I think getting all these prizes out of the way early in one's career, I think there's something to be said for that.
I believe I can best highlight the difference between the generations by expressing myself figuratively. Butlers of my father's generation, I would say, tended to see the world in terms of a ladder. the houses of royalty, dukes, and the lords from the oldest families placed at the top, those of new money lower down, and so on, until one reached a point below which the hierarchy was determined simply by wealth, or the lack of it. Any butler with ambition simply did his best to climb as high up this ladder as possible, and by and large, the higher he went, the greater his professional prestige. For our generation, I believe it is accurate to say, viewed the world not as a ladder, but more as a wheel.
Although you have written screenplays, in the cases of both Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, you didn't, although presumably you would have had first choice. That was deliberate.
I would hate to even attempt to write a screenplay of something I've already written up as a novel. I mean, and also I don't think I would be able to do it very well. I think it does need a fresh eye. Not to say, you know, someone is a better screenwriter than me to come along, because you have to be quite cruel to the novel. You know, you have to say, look, I mean, that's all very well, but that's all going out. You know, it's like finishing your A-levels or something and then being told you have to do them all over again or something. When I come to the end of a novel, you know, I'm so relieved. I mean, I often feel I'm never going to figure out how on earth to finish the novel. Sometimes I'm desperate. I just use every low device available to a novelist to try and just get certain things to work. And you know, I cheat, you know, just anything, you know, let's just make this thing work, you know, just get, you know. And it's such a relief to come to the end, you know, and you publish it, and you know, you think, whew, got away with it. And the truth is, although I have written screenplays, both for cinema and television, I don't think I'm nearly as good a screenwriter as I'm a novelist. And I remain fascinated, though, by the difference between telling a story in film and telling a story in a novel. And it's partly almost like a voyeuristic interest. You know, I like to hang around films and film sets, and you know, the whole.
Will Self has declared the death of the novel.
Well, but people always declare the death of a novel every few years. But there's actually a huge. And I think it's rather nice that every now and again, you know, quite regularly every month, the Hollywood PR industry, you know, this massive industry, comes out to back some novel because there's been a film adaptation, you know, whether it's Gone Girl or whatever, you know. And I've benefited from that, obviously, you know, with the adaptations. But I think it kind of makes sense because there's a huge crossover between the cinema audience and the novel reading audience. And so I'm quite optimistic about the future of storytelling.
We talked about gaining a much bigger audience with Remains of the Day because of the Man Booker and the movie. There is a view, The Unconsoled, 1995, very different book, 500 pages, sort of European Kafkaesque fable. There is a view you set out to lose your massive readership with that book.
No, I'm not so strong as a person. My artistic integrity isn't so so advanced as to deliberately set out to lose an audience. I have this, perhaps it's a naive hope that, you know, but I think a whole wide range of people, I think, can understand my novels and get some sort of emotional feelings out of them. And that's, so when I write my novels, I don't like to put any artificial barriers in the way of readers. That I don't want to ever write a novel that only people who are very familiar with Shakespeare or familiar with Dante or something would understand. You know, I even if the concept was good, I wouldn't do it because I feel I am communicating with a readership. You know. But as you mentioned, you know, the Unconsoled, a lot of people think, some people think is a difficult novel, but I don't think...
It got a pretty savage reception, didn't it?
It got a savage reception, but it's a book that's severely divided people. I can well understand. You know, I've had my worst and best reviews in my life for that particular book. I can see that it's not a book for everybody, but I don't think the readers divide neatly into, say, people who've studied English literature at university and people who haven't. Often the people who come to my literary events and and say, oh, I really love The Unconsoled. Those people I can't pigeonhole in any kind of way. You know, I think it's, somebody suggested that the division has to do with humour. There are some people who find that book very funny and people who do not find it funny at all, and that's a division.
For a few seconds, Stefan had gone on sitting without playing, trying desperately to shake off the effects of the wine and to run through in his mind the piece he was about to attempt. For one giddying moment, he saw the possibility, it had after all been an evening of remarkable things, that he would somehow perform at a level never before attained, and that he would finish to find his parents smiling, applauding, and exchanging with each other looks of deep affection. But no sooner had he commenced the opening bar of Mallory's Epicycloid, he had realized the utter impossibility of any such scenario.
People who love my other books absolutely hate it, you know. And I could never quite work out the, you know, what the determining factors were. But I think this might be the key to it. I mean,
So it's a sort of absurdist nightmare, and if you find it funny, then it works. And
yeah, I intended the thing to be very funny.
Right.
And some people do find it funny. Not in a kind of jokey kind of way, but a lot of it is surrealist comedy.
Based on your usual publishing rhythm, there should be a new novel in around 2020, I think. Do you have any sense of what it will be?
I have several candidates.
Including the vampire novel?
I think the vampire novel is in abeyance because of the Twilight phenomenon. I'm at the moment I am quite interested in the genre of noir. You know, slightly different to just a straight thriller or police procedural. I would make a kind of distinction between you know, noir thrillers that have professionals in, you know, professional gangsters, cops, you know, private detectives, and ones in which, you know, ordinary people are sucked into some sort of strange nightmare. And I'm interested in the latter. You know, my model will be more people like James Ellroy or people like that, you know, or the great noir movies of the 1940s. You know, these kind of urban nightmares of ordinary people who get sucked into kind of really strange things.
And first-person narrator, you would think?
I mean, first-person narrative is very good when you're exploring just one individual and their struggle with their past, their memories, how they face up to themselves. When you're talking about how a marriage or relationship is doing that, or how a society is doing that, I kind of thought it is not so good. You know, it might be better to approach it with kind of multiple viewpoints. And so, to some extent, it will depend on what I'm doing. You know, I mean, I like the first-person narrative because I'm still at heart a singer-songwriter.
Well, we wait to find out. Kazuo Ishiguro, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.